everyone to another edition of the NatCon Australia podcast. Today I'm delighted to welcome Senator Gerard Rennick, who is a long-time friend of mine and someone I've known for at least almost 10 years, I think. Senator Rennick is the Senator for the state of Queensland, Australia. Throughout his term, he has gained a reputation for bucking the bipartisan consensus on many issues, probably most notably the response to COVID, but also on other issues related to trade, foreign policy, and other matters. So welcome, Gerard. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks, Dan. How are you?
Great, very well. The first thing I want to mention is that when I said to different people that I know in my network that I was interviewing today, not only Australia, but overseas, they said to mention to you how they appreciate what you've done over the last couple of years. And these are people, Swiss dudes, German dudes, French dudes that I've known in different parts of the world. And it's sort of amazing. They wouldn't know the political system of Australia. They wouldn't know probably the Prime Minister. But, that Gerard Rennick, he seems to have made a name for himself. And so that's sort of kind of somewhat unique. I mean, what allies do you have there in Canberra? Who do you share think you're on the same wavelength with down there?
Well, in Canberra, Dan, I actually get on very well with most of my Queensland federal colleagues. Obviously, in the Senate, Matt Canavan, Alex Antic, Matt O'Sullivan, Slade Brockman, Andrew McLaughlin, and in the lower house, guys like Luke Howarth, Garth Hamilton, Phil Thompson, Terry Young, Colin Boyce, Lou O'Brien. So lots of guys there. I feel like I've missed someone there. I got on well with Peter, Dutton. So yeah, no, I get on well, and even like a lot of ironically enough, in the prior government, when under the Morrison government, I got on very well with guys like Jason Falinski and Tim Wilson as well. We often came at things from a different angle. They were more sort of libertarian style liberals, whereas I call myself a protectionist because I believe the role of government is to protect the rights and freedoms of the individual and their families, rather than just have a let the market rip approach. Not that I think the market is a very important mechanism for productivity, but like all these things, there's no fail-safe mechanism. There's no it's like we never got 100% for every subject we did at school. There's lots of private companies throughout my years, observing the stock market have gone under, gone broke. We've had stock market crashes, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no one model fits all, and you've got to keep an open mind and basically be able to adapt to the circumstances as they arise. Now, look, there's no doubt that in the early 80s, our financial system was very constrained and we needed to open it up. But I think with the benefit of hindsight and about 40 years of experience now, is that we possibly let the market rip a bit too much. And we're now really facing some severe economic headwinds, of which the groundwork was laid four decades ago. But back to your initial question, I get on with most people in Canberra. It's going to be fun throwing out these policies. I'll say this now that I'm no longer in the LNP. I'm running really hard on policies, and I just want to talk about policies, right? I don't want to get into the toxicity of the party.
No.
I mean, I'm not saying this to you, but just as one of the things I do want to do for the remainder of this term, and who knows what will happen, if I get over the line or not, but is to actually just go hard on issues. And the issues that inspired me to run for politics in the first place.
Yeah, that's what I want to focus on, not the party machinations or who's up or who's down. I'm just kind of curious as to who you get on with and down there. And this leads me to a second kind of, it's a very basic civics question, but and it's something you probably address to Year 9 school students that travel through the halls of Canberra, but it's something that I think people have been increasingly concerned about. How are decisions made in federal parliament? How is it? What is the process that leads to a bill being introduced or an executive decision being made? There's a very simple Civics 101 answer to that. But in your experience, how does it actually happen, and what are what concerns do you have about that process as it currently exists?
Okay, that is a very, very good question, Dan. And I have to admit, as a backbencher, even I don't have the full optics over how exactly the decisions are made. But long story short, it's generally on incumbent upon the minister of the day, who's effectively the CEO of that department, to come up with bills to the necessary bills to keep the department and whatever that department's responsibilities going. It is incumbent upon that minister. Now, that minister will have to take whatever he decides he wants to do to cabinet, and then cabinet will then need to either approve or disapprove of the proposed suggestions made by the minister in regards to executing decisions that they may or may not want to do. Now, the quality of the decision making and who comes up with those decisions will depend on the minister themselves, and how well, how much autonomy and how well they manage their own department. So some ministers will have their own ideas. Other ministers will be much, much more reliant on their bureaucracy. I have to be honest with you, it's hard to tell, if you're not actually in that cabinet, to know who's, an original thinker or who is actually driven and inspired to make these decisions themselves, versus who's being led by the nose by the bureaucrats or the media in some or vested interests. And I should put that in there because it's interesting. One thing that I found very peculiar earlier this year that didn't really get as much media coverage as I would have liked was when apparently text messages, and I'll stand to be corrected on this, but I'm pretty sure text messages between Mike Pizzullo and Scott Briggs were released. And my understanding is Scott Briggs is a lobbyist and Mike Pizzullo was the head of the Home Affairs Department, I think. And I just found it interesting that, bureaucrats speaking to lobbyists, and it just got me. And I mean, I have no visibility on any of this, but how much lobbyists go directly to bureaucrats and how well do those two sectors, vested interests, whatever you want to call them, how interconnected are they? Because it's interesting, because I've never been a minister. Once my time in Parliament is up, even if I wanted to become a lobbyist, and I don't, I probably wouldn't be worth much as a lobbyist because I don't have the names and the contacts of the people in the department, unless I went to estimates and started writing their names down and then had to, and even then they wouldn't give me their numbers, their contact details. I don't think they're allowed to. So there's, even for a backbencher, both as when I was in government, and admittedly, I know a lot more now than what I did in the first 3 years. It's a bit of a pantomime, the Canberra the chamber and Parliament House. All we're really doing is voting on those decisions. The decisions themselves have already been made, and 1 out of every 10, I'm guessing this figure, but a small minority of these decisions require, you won't get non-controversial legislation. So it will be controversial, i.e. the parties will split. But a lot of the legislation, they don't even bother splitting. They just, it just goes through on the voices because there's no opposition from Labor, which is the other one of the two major parties, or vice. When we're in government, there's no opposition. Now that we're in opposition, there's no opposing voices from us. So it's a good question, Dan. And to be honest, it's one of those things that would vary on department, vary on quality of minister, vary on the ability and skills of the bureaucrats within that department, the skills of the lobbyists, etc., and the vibe in the public too. Sometimes the public can sort of an issue may be sitting there simmering under the surface for years and then suddenly blow up. And then it's all the rage for a certain period of time, then it dies down again. I mean, I well remember on our first Senate campaign, it was Section 18C, and how Tony Abbott backed down on that. That was all the rage. And that was the discussion amongst Conservatives, and that was the outrage of the day. And of course, that's all been forgotten about.
Not by me. But so the reason why I ask, again, it's sort of basic civics question, but has been over the last couple of years an incredible conformity or homogeny amongst the legislative programs, not only in Australia but elsewhere in the world. And you wonder, how to account for that? Is it different bureaucrats at a lower level chatting to each other, or they're reading about the same issues that we are, and we just happen to be responding in a similar way. I mean, you would think that, especially with the experience of COVID, that there would at the very least be an advantage in having some countries do things slightly different, so you could see how it turned out for them, and then use that as a metric to determine, what policies work and what policies don't work. I mean, that, we saw Sweden, which was the control in the experiment. They seem to have bucked the trend, but it's beyond that, right? There seem to be these trends globally where all nations tend to follow along the same lines, and I'm just wondering how that actually comes to be. It's
Oh, Dan, that's simple. It's the concentration of media and the concentration of capital. So all these compulsory forced savings plans, whether it's superannuation here in Australia, 401k in the States, BlackRock, Vanguard. I mean, I know this is overused, but it's not. This isn't fringe conspiracy stuff. This is very real. I think BlackRock has something like $9 trillion in funds under management. Vanguard's at about 8, and I think State Street's at about 5 trillion. Now, you don't need to control 100% of the company. You generally only need about 20 to 30% of control, just depending on the type of shareholding. But that concentration of capital has then got a concentration of control over the media, a concentration control over, your arms industry, a concentration of control over your banks, et cetera, et cetera. And you will often see similar board members. Doesn't have to be a lot, but these board members in this club, they're very interconnected. And I'll give you, and on top of that, then you've got, and because the media is so concentrated now, they all put out a message. And I'm sure many of your listeners would have seen those clips going around on social media where they'll get one TV station, reading the nightly bulletin, and then they'll suddenly bring on another TV station and another TV station, and it'll fill up to 20 or 30 TV stations, and they are literally reading the same notes. Now, that is a combination, and that's not necessarily nefarious either. That's just what's happened is, as companies have naturally tried to be more efficient, what they do is, so we've got 20 or 30 TV channels. We're just going to produce the content in one, back office, and then we're going to give that to all of our regional networks to read exactly the same thing. Now, a lot of the people doing that are just thinking, well, if you're the cost accountant in the back room going, well, this will save a lot of money. You may not even be doing it because you're sitting there with some evil hat on going, we want to control the world. It's not necessarily anything like that. They're just doing it because they're trying to lower costs and basically generate more returns for their shareholders. Okay, that's why you need, and it's interesting. I didn't give it a lot of thought when it happened, and I can't remember if it happened under Morrison or Turnbull, but we abolished the cross media ownership laws. Now, I think we need to go back to having a greater division, a separation of media ownership in this country. We are effectively controlled, or, I'm guessing this, but I suspect in terms of mainstream media, it'd be Murdoch, the ABC News, and then the 9 Fairfax stable that probably delivers, guessing this, 70 or 80% of mainstream media news. So yet again, and, I can, I've seen this whereby the same, and I've seen it with the radio stations whereby Queensland radio stations now will hook into the New South Wales Sydney radio station, and I'll just push those. So it's called affiliated networks. Nothing new in that. So it's when you've got a single mouthpiece or a very narrow funnel through which the message is directed, it does become very easy to control. Now, the other thing I think has lowered, that has contributed to this narrowing of opinion, is if you dare speak out against the narrative, you are bullied. And I think there's a pushback. And, it's great to see guys like Musk and Tucker Carlson and all these guys. But even I can speak personally myself. I mean, when I first, just before I got up in 19, I copped a caning on social media there at one stage. The ABC did a beat up on me. Yeah, and it intimidated me. I was shocked by the level of vitriol directed at me. And of course, the party said, don't say anything, you can't say anything. So these guys the ABC just had 4 days running stories on me that I couldn't answer. Whereas now that I'm in Parliament and experienced, I would shut that down. I can shut that down much quicker because I can respond, and I'm lucky in the sense that I do, excuse me, have a large social media following that will also come in behind me. So, I've got the weight of numbers and the confidence of my own, the courage of my own convictions and confidence in my own intelligence to actually take these people on in a debate. And quite often, when you start quoting facts and figures at the people attacking you and making personal smears, they don't have a comeback because they're only, they're just basically schoolyard bullies who have absolutely no substance.
How do you, going forward, stop this situation where you get these digital stampedes or these media stampedes, which then cause the government to have to respond, and usually you get ill thought through legislation? Or how do you put a break on that realistically? Because it's, we saw it during COVID, but it'll be something else down the track where um, people will bolt, and it'll be very hard to stop the public demanding action on a particular issue, and it'll be very hard for the police to say no to that. What breaks can be put on that?
Okay. So, first of all, you need leaders who actually have the courage of their convictions. That's incredibly, incredibly important. And we have lacked leadership where they have the courage of their own convictions. And that's going right back to probably John Howard. Tony Abbott was good for a while, but then sort of lost his way towards the end there. And I mean, I don't know whether it was, it became a self-fulfilling thing with Tony, but and to be fair to all the leaders, the media now, and I've said this before, 20 or 30 years ago when I grew up, I'll say 40 years ago when I grew up, you'd wake up in the morning, you might get the 7:45 a.m. ABC News Bulletin, and followed by AM, and then you wouldn't then get the news again until either the 6 o'clock news on the private channels or the 7 o'clock news on ABC. The only other news you would get throughout the day is you went up to the news agents and got the paper. Today, the news cycle is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I mean, on a Sunday, for example, you just literally, I mean, I remember growing up as a kid, you'd sit around with nothing to do. Right now, it's just you're on some sort of device, some sort of disruptive technology nonstop. So it is harder. Politics is harder, and that's why you've got to have the courage of convictions. But you've also got to have confidence in your own intelligence. I mean, you've got to be prepared to understand the issue and then push back. I mean, I get a lot of pushback. I seem to have sort of, it's not so much COVID anymore, but the climate change stuff is coming back, and I'm running some ideas that other politicians haven't run before, like the crazy idea that CO2 is a gas, and gases are shocking conductors of heat. So a CO2 molecule can't just heat up, 6,000 other N2O2 molecules. It's not that easy. Or a greenhouse is a closed system. The atmosphere is an open system. Why are you comparing an atmosphere to a greenhouse? Because they're two separate things. A closed system obviously being able to prevent convection, i.e. hot air from rising, whereas the atmosphere, you will have gravity, but convection, as something gets hotter, the heat will overcome the gravity. So I'm talking at a level where most journalists and a lot of people don't even understand. But that is the level you've got to go to, because when I start, and I've had a pile on this week by some foreign blogger who, by the way, was, when I looked into his little quote, he quoted a link to a website that was being funded by CNN and New York Times. So I sort of take that as a compliment. But, so that pile on, you've got to be ready for it. And you do get a thicker skin. So you do get the experience over time of dealing with this. And the only way you're going to get it is actually by putting yourself out there and being attacked. But then also we've got social media, Twitter, the change in social media from Elon Musk, when Elon Musk took over X, Twitter, has been astonishing. He's been able to shut down, because Twitter was just a cesspit when I first started in politics. And gee, it was bad. It was really, really bad. Facebook wasn't too bad, but its censorship got worse, obviously, throughout COVID. But even Zuckerberg last week is now, backing away from what went down. And the other thing is too, a lot of these narratives are falling apart. You take the Trump narrative and the collusion with Russia. Well, actually, no, it turns out all that was fake. But Hunter Biden, the son of the US president, was taking kickbacks from Ukraine, China, photos of him smoking ice, etc., etc. Well, all of this stuff, like this stuff's all been out there in front of Congress. And when people see the disconnect between how the Bidens have been completely left alone and then Trump's attacked for any little thing he does, people can start to see, yeah, it's becoming obvious. And even with myself, I've had Albanese again, had a go at me yesterday, he had another go at me a couple of weeks ago where he called me a conspiracy theorist and a cooker. People are old enough, like the behaviour of politicians is getting worse. They are losing their decorum. And they're not like, I don't agree with much of what Keating did, but, he could at least get up there and be whip smart in the chamber, as could Hawke, and even, Costello and Howard. But today, like, it's really, and I have to sit through this stuff myself in question time, and I can't do it anymore, is just listening to the hackling back and forth. I mean, some people are better at it than others and can be quite witty, but it's at the point though. I just want to start talking about the solutions.
Yeah,
and that's
sure.
the campaign I want to run the next 8 months.
Yeah, I hear you. I just want to. It is an interesting area because I always find that. Well, what concerns me is that there really aren't, even within the parties, there should be independent voices and different perspectives, right? But we seem to increasingly have like an homogeny of opinion on issues, and there are very few people that buck the trend. And that's not great in a democracy. Like, there'll be things I disagree with you on and all the rest of it. But I feel like democracy is safer when you've got a lot of more independent-minded people in parliament rather than people that are just drone-like voting because that seems to be the way the kind of winds are blowing. They get into, a lot of people get into, it can't be healthy for democracy, having that sort of culture and that lack of willingness to take a stand. That's what the sort of legends of politics are built on.
Then, and that's partly because the careerists are becoming a larger and larger part of both major parties. The toxicity in politics is turning people off from even running. Step one. And I don't know if I don't get back in. I'd like to think I can get a job, but I'll also know that there'll be a large chunk of prospective employers that won't touch me because I've been a politician. So a lot of people won't bother running just because they know that once they're tarred with the political brush, they're going to ruin their career prospects. And of course, the result of that is you end up with more careerists winning pre-selections, and then because their only career has been in the political sphere, whether as a staffer or a lobbyist, they need to stay into politics to rely on a living. They've got nowhere else to go back to. So I think a part of that homogeny of message, along with the bullying and everything in the media and as we just discussed, it is narrowing, diverse opinion.
Yeah, right. I always think that, when democracies or whatever work best, it's when you had the citizen soldier of the sort of Roman times or Greek times, or you had early days of the American Republic, those independent-minded farmers who, would go back to the farm afterwards and didn't really care. They had independent sources of wealth, so they didn't need to rely on lobbyists and much, or think about their next job as much, because they could survive without thinking about that. I want to get into some more NatCon themes and some policy stuff too, but it would be remiss of me and people who have approached me not to ask, how far away do you think we are from a true reckoning on the COVID response? Is it something that'll never happen? Is it something that could happen under a new Trump term, or could happen in Australia, and people will start to realize there's so much craziness there and people need to be held more fully accountable than they have been yet?
Well, okay, so your best hope in the short term is Trump getting in and Bobby Kennedy actually, Robert JFK Jr., not JFK, RFK Jr., whatever the initials are, sorry, being able to persuade Trump to have a COVID inquiry and for people, and for people to be held to account. Now, if that was to happen in the US, and it won't happen, it'll never happen under a Labor government. It's unlikely to happen under a Liberal government. But if, for example, I could get back in and we got a Liberal government back in as well. So Peter Dutton was Prime Minister. It's the best way for that to happen is if I could leverage some sort of reckoning with Peter to do it. Now, I use this as not quite the perfect example, but there's never been a reckoning on Iraq, Dan. Okay, I mean, we went in and invaded a country. I'll say we, the West, and it was based on a lie. And millions of people had their lives destroyed. And I think I'll stand to be corrected on this, but certainly a million people were probably injured, if not killed. There's been no reckoning on that, right? So, people don't. I mean, I talked to another group of people, infected blood, who were clearly damaged by government neglect. They have never really seen any sort of compensation or justice. So, I wish I could say to you what comes around goes around, but it doesn't. And
sorry, go on, Matt. There has been. I was going to say there hasn't been a complete reckoning with Iraq, but there has been a correction since the since the Trump presidency about whether these interventions, quote unquote, that the West has conducted over the last 30 years were wise. I mean, no one's been held responsible for the errors, but there's certainly, at least in the US, I feel like at the foreign policy level, you've got JD Vance and other people saying, very direct things that I think he said recently, some of these conflicts are just none of our business. Well, that's not the attitude that existed under George W. Bush and many of the Republican Democrat presidents prior. So there's been a correction, if not a complete reckoning, right? You'd accept that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's been an acknowledgement, that's right, but not an accountability. And you'll see that with thalidomide, just like, was it this year or last year? You can't remember now. Albanese came out and apologised to people who suffered, the children who suffered from thalidomide. The only unfortunate thing about that was that it happened 60 years ago. Most of the children who suffered under thalidomide, as well as the mothers and fathers, have all passed away. So, look, short term, our best chance is Trump leading the reckoning, right? And if anyone's going to do it, it will be Trump and his administration. If it shapes up, you've got the likes of Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson and Robert Kennedy Jr. in his cabinet influencing this, and Vivek for that matter as well. So, and then that, we are influenced by what happens in the US. So, because I really want to get Skerritt. I mean, what that guy did, and look, and I'll say something about Skerritt as I did with Morrison early on. Don't get me wrong, it was all, it would have been very hard to say this is all beat up. But when it became obvious, you need to do something, and you need to do it under fire. These people that come out after the event, like Don Perrottet a couple of weeks ago, and he said, I didn't believe in mandates, went too far. Well, mate, you could have done something about it. You were there at the time. So look, I'll keep fighting for it, obviously. I do think we've got to be, it's one of these things, if I was number one on the ticket, do you keep your mouth shut longer to get into the ministry and lobby from within the cabinet? I mean, because I was number three on the ticket, I was the marginal seat. We had One Nation up here in Queensland. You can't be a shrinking violet number three on the LNP ticket because you're up against One Nation. But at the same time, it's not always the case that the squeaky oil gets the squeaky engine gets the oil, and sometimes it's a balance. So you've got to be able to know how to influence people, and I think that the best way to get this is to actually do it behind closed doors. When I say behind, not trying to be not transparent, but that's probably not the right way of doing it. Try through engaging in direct conversations with the influencers, the people who have the power, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Cool, man. Turning to some other more, what I call national conservative themes, like trade. You describe yourself as a protectionist, Now, are you the only member of the Liberal Party in federal parliament at the moment who would describe themselves in those terms? And I just note that because Menzies, the founder of the party, described himself as a protectionist. So it's sort of interesting that the literal founder of the party, and one who was always in recent times being used as this, the lodestar that we all sort of have to follow. He had views on trade which are very different to pretty much everyone in the current federal Liberal Party. Would that be right?
You'd be close to being right. And look, obviously, there was a big change in mindset around the 1980s. And I mean, maybe it was before then. I mean, I was born in 1970, so my sort of first political awareness was around the early 80s. Actually, the first federal election I can remember was the 83 election where Fraser lost to Hawke. So that was my first recollection of federal politics. So there was a big, but interestingly enough, I suppose I went through and got my secondary education and university degree throughout those heady days of the 1980s. So I'm old enough to remember, when deregulating the financial market was a big deal in 85, floating the currency, capital gains discount, the capital gains exemption on housing, the FBT coming in, the stock market crash of 87, those things I remember well. So, and then obviously the Dawkins plan, because I copped a couple of years of HECS. So I got off scot-free in the first year, and then it was either the second or third year I had HECS debt, and I was lucky enough, I was working at the time, and I sort of paid it off, within 1 or 2 years of leaving uni. But so they're the sort of things, and then of course the button plan as well, which was a big one, and that was a real that era. So my eldest sister, who was born in 1964, she finished school in 1981. When she started high school, it must have been 77. She had 4 classes in grade 8. This is out at Chinchilla State High. By the time she graduated in 81, there was half a class left in year 12. So just about all men, or bar a handful, and all those ones that stayed till year 12 went on to university, basically left and went into trades. And even in my year, so I started 83 and then went to 85, and then it's go down these last 2 years. But I obviously kept in touch with my mates from home. We started off with 4 classes in grade 8, and we were probably down to about 3. So even in the 6 years between my sister and myself, more and more people started staying on. And then, now, of course, you don't just stay on till year 12. You're nearly just about, I couldn't tell you exactly what percentage, but a large percentage of children then go on and do university. So they're not getting out into the workforce until they're 23, 24. Whereas, say, 50 years ago, a lot of people were, people were in the workforce by the time they're 15 or 16. So that era, and when they went to the workforce, they didn't necessarily go and become accountants or lawyers in grade 9 or 10. They went and got apprenticeships. And so that, as those apprenticeships died out with the button plan, and we encouraged manufacturing to go offshore, and we were going to be this service economy, we're now coming to the end of that last. So it's now 40 years on since then. So that last generation of your tradies, or large percentage of tradies, and I think this is one of the reasons why we've got a hands-on skill shortage, is that we don't have the future homegrown generations coming through, because they all went off to university and they've all got these degrees in psychology or sports marketing or sports management. I love that one, sports management. Sports management in my day, out at the Chinchilla Bulldogs, it was literally having a key, going out to the footy training on a Tuesday night, opening up the shed, getting the footy equipment out and turning the lights on. That was it, and then, the caravan would turn up on a Sunday with the pie, the pies, and it was all run by volunteers. Yeah. So, we've monetarised a lot of these things, whether it's sport management, childcare is one of my favourite topics. That's been completely monetarised. Managing your own, for your own retirement is monetarised at a cost of $30 billion. Heavens know how many people we employ in that industry at a cost of $30 billion. Gambling, poker machines. I mean, Chinchilla never had poker machines when I grew up, but we had a maternity ward. Now we've got poker machines and no maternity ward. So we've become a society that's much more leisurely, less productive, and less self-reliant. So all of these things, I guess, and this has been driven by political ideology, that neoliberal ideology that, I don't want to use the word uni party because I've just come out of Liberal Party, so it sounds a bit like a hypocrite, but that neoliberal ideology was also embraced by the Howard and Peacock era, where we took it on board. So But back to your original question, that there are more and more politicians within the caucus, so within both the lower house and upper house, that I think realise there's more to it than just let the markets rip. And as I say to them, a lot of my colleagues, and I'll say to your listeners, it's like when we took the hands off the reins of power in the 80s, i.e. the protectionists, the communists and the Marxists couldn't believe their luck. They said, well, if you're not going to take the reins of power, we will. And that's what I mean by protectionism, which is sort of the American version of patriotism, is that, and we've all heard this expression used, freedom's only good for one generation, or you can lose it within one generation. You have to fight for freedom. And this is where I disagree with the libertarians. I think they think you just step back and let it happen, and everything's going to take care of itself.
When did your views evolve? Like in the 80s, would you have thought, was a sort of, to the extent that you were politically engaged or thinking about these things, would they have changed over the years? Because there's that old Australia, heritage Australia, whatever you want to call it, that understood these issues, that understand and looks back at it and thinks, geez, look what we have lost. We've deindustrialized, our skill base is this, that, and the other, been decimated, our economy's been financialized. But there's another group of people that doesn't have that same type of experience that you have and can't remember it, and just think this is as like a fish swimming in water. This is the normal state of affairs, and doesn't appreciate what has been lost. Was there a particular moment where you thought, hang on, this thing doesn't make sense, or were you always skeptical about the direction of travel during the Hawke-Keating, Howard 80s and 90s?
I can actually tell you the time and place, as in time as in year, and the subject. It was my first subject in not the Forgan Smith, what's the little Pizza Hut building at university? Oh, I should know it. It's not the Forgan Smith. It's the one up there near the rec club. It's just escaped my mind there. It's one of the ones you used. We used, it was EC1, no, it wasn't. It was CO131. Ted Hooke was the lecturer. So if you've got any commerce boys from the 80s at UQ, you'll remember Ted Hooke. And
just lost you, man. Just wait for Gerard to come back.
So we're back. Yeah.
No worries. Ted Hooke, you were saying that the moment then you realised you had your view changed.
Wait a minute now, I can't hear you. Something.
We had a break, and you were back telling me about Ted Hooke from the Commerce Department.
Yeah, so we'll resume. Sorry about that. We just had someone call and it broke the recording there. So, so I was sitting in, it's going to eat me up now. I feel like I should know the name of that building because it was one I spent so much time in. But yeah, Ted Hooke was describing how when the market was completely efficient as regards information, and that when a company made an announcement to the ASX, that information was already fully priced in, and that meant that the market was efficient. And I literally just bought my first shares on the stock market in September 87, as did my dear mum. And we had our asses handed to us on a plate, of course, about a month later. So we sort of got quite the brutal introduction to the stock market. And funnily enough, though, literally weeks before that, I bought some shares in Bell Resources about a day before someone, I think Bond, made a takeover, and I made a bit of a killing on it. And so I knew that what Ted Hooke had just told me was complete rubbish because, well, for two reasons. First of all, because if the market is, the price is already factored in, the information is already factored into the price, that means someone's buying on inside information, right? So it's not efficient, it's insider information. But then secondly, it's not always insider information. Like sometimes you do generally have an announcement and the price kicks. I've also seen, and funnily enough, this was a gene technology stock called Viralytics, which I had shares in that biotech before I became a senator. And it was coming out with good results as far as it was doing trials on people with cancer, and it was using gene technology on people who were basically stage 3, stage 4 cancer, which, I'm not saying gene technology is good or bad, but if you're going to do trials, you're going to do it on people that you've got no.
I hear you.
yeah, they're going to die if you don't do something, right? Not for something like COVID where most people survive. So, but every time it came out with good news, the price kept going lower and lower. And I actually sold out because in the end, it ended up getting taken over by an American pharmaceutical company. But this is the difference between the 80s and today. Back in the 80s, you had stamp duty. So you couldn't just grind a stock down through high frequency trading because it didn't cost anything. And that's what you see today on the stock market. You'll see high frequency traders, hence why I want to bring back stamp duty on share trading to get rid of payroll tax, because these high frequency traders just load the buy and the sell and they grind the price. They just basically kill. And then, of course, you've got secondary markets now where they jump in between the pips and you can't actually get. So they'll just sit there trading between the pips all day to basically bore smaller investors out of the price. So no, so I've always had a questioning mindset, and I could never understand. The one thing that puzzled me was, that was another thing that always I could never understand was they said you can't print money out of thin air. And to me, it was like, but that's exactly where money comes from, is out of thin air. But then, so that puzzled me. Like that puzzled me for decades, and it wasn't actually until, even just as a senator, and I was a Treasury accountant for years, and we'd always be paying interest and taking bonds out in the US. And it always used to bug me that we never raise money here anymore, because I know when they built the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge or whatever, they'd raise bonds in Australia. But I knew that didn't make sense, and it's taken me years to be able to understand it in a manner that I can explain it simply. But all credit, debt or equity, is an arbitrary construct. But what it is a real thing. So if you say on your balance sheet you've got a tractor, as an auditor, you know exactly when you're auditing what it is that you look for, right? You look for the tractor. But if I'll say this to you, and I'll just give you a little clue as to the answer. You're a lawyer, so you should know this. But if I'm auditing debt and equity, what am I looking for?
Well, it depends on the context. I don't like debt and equity. I mean, you're looking for what assets underwrite.
No. The assets, the tractor.
Mm.
Right. What is the substance of debt and equity? What is it?
It's capital.
Yeah, it's capital. But what is it? But what is capital?
Well, it's the value of it is determined by future earnings.
No. That's the net present. That's the value of the asset, right? What capital is title. It's a legal document. So it's either the bank. So on Zoom, legal document. Okay, so we're back on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So capital is the legal document that tells you who controls the asset, right? That's what capital is. It's either a mortgage or it's title. Now, as a sovereign country, what is the definition of a sovereign country? What does the rights? What is the benefit of being a sovereign country?
Well, at a certain level, you have the ability to control your destiny, both your economic and your other types of the direction your country might take. It is a good question.
Okay, so that was a rhetorical question. I'll answer it for you. You have title over all the untapped wealth in this country. That's what it means, is that you have title over the land, the rain that comes out of the sky, the sunlight, the soil. Now, the reason why that matters is when you understand that is what you control as a country, you can then justify issuing more credit in a responsible manner, right? So the 1937 Banking Royal Commission made a recommendation that the central bank should always control the volume of credit in a system. Right, that's very, very important, because that's the best advice. And thanks to Bert Van Mennen, the member for Ford, for giving me that Royal Commission, because that was probably the document that made where the scales came off my eyes. Because suddenly I looked at credit as a volume thing, and if you're going to increase the population of Australia, which is your asset, so let's say from 2000 to 2020, 24, we've gone from 18 million people to 27 million people. As our debit on the balance sheet has increased, we've got to fill in that debit with a credit, right? Now, do you want to fill that credit in with foreign debt, or do you want to fill it in with domestic equity? I say we should do it with domestic equity, right? But if you want to expand so let's say we want to do it with domestic equity, how do we expand the volume of credit? We do it in a productive manner. And how do we do that? We do it by issuing infrastructure bonds that are secured against sovereign assets, right? Because that way then we are matching title, right, to the asset. Now, that's not a radical idea. I mean, if I came to you and said, Dan, I'm going to move a bill next week in Parliament that's going to ban companies from issuing their own shares and they can only raise capital through foreign debt, you'd think that was a pretty crazy idea, wouldn't you? But that's effectively because we have been, I forget which coloured pill it is, but we've taken the red pill. I think we've all been red pilled to such an extent that we don't realise that as a government, we too can issue shares in our own equity, right? So, i.e. infrastructure bonds, right? And what all infrastructure bonds are is we will issue one share called untapped wealth. That will start an infrastructure bank that will then issue infrastructure bonds back to the federal government or the state government, depending on which infrastructure you want to build. And then what that means is that when you repay the cost of the capital on that infrastructure, right, you're keeping the money in Australia. Whereas if you use foreign debt, let's say it costs $1 billion to build a dam and you fund that via foreign debt, the first $1 billion in wealth you create, you have to repay offshore. So that is the fundamental lie of the neoliberal 1980s mindset, where they said, we're going to open up the market to the rest of the world. We're going to allow the banks to borrow as much foreign debt as they want. And you know what? We're going to tell everyone that you can't print money. Now, I'm not saying we should go out and just print money for consumption or consuming, but we do need to issue or expand the volume of credit in the same way the companies issue shares in a productive manner that is secured against sovereign assets. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. I have got a million questions and I don't want to get bogged down. Who else has done this to date effectively would be my first question.
Lachlan Macquarie for a start. He came, so first 17 years of the colony, they relied on foreign currency. There was a drought in 1805. The foreign currency got repatriated. There was no currency left in the colony. They started bartering rum and it literally went tits up, right? Lachlan Macquarie was the first governor to come after Governor Bligh. He was the first governor to see Australia as a country and not a colony. He knew that in order to manage and run a country, you need to control the taxation system, the monetary system, and law and order / military, right? He issued the holy dollar, and with the holy dollar, that basically built the Sydney Hospital, which still stands in Macquarie Street today, and the Sydney Barracks. Ironically enough, just across the road from the RBA, which of course doesn't do anything like that. They just think you should manipulate the price of money. And apparently we live in a free society, but manipulating the price of money on the first Tuesday of every month's okay. I mean, if that's not price controls, I don't know what is. But yet again, the Chinese have issued their own bonds.
Yeah, there's been a financialization of the economy since the 80s, so that every house, rather than being a home and having the focus being it on what it can provide people, it's become a financial instrument which has effectively been globalized, and the house of price has gone out of control, and young people can afford housing, and that doesn't really turn up on any traditional balance sheets, but it is obviously a major accounting point, right? I guess that the other thing is like I said, there's lots of things where you can quibble with, but to me it seems quite obvious that there is a huge amount of the Australia that existed pre-1980, which was very admirable, both in terms of social cohesion, productive capacity, general well-being of the population. Also, a mate was talking about the other day, there was a much more kind of easygoing attitude because people weren't in debt up to their eyeballs, and there was a much more relaxed nature that Australia. Well, not to say there weren't challenges; there were huge challenges, but these days there's not quite. That has been lost to a certain extent, and it's interesting people who remember that time. Not saying you're old, but you come from regional Queensland, as do I. And you have a much better sense of it than, say, people who have only ever lived in a sort of capital city and lived in a small little, apartment from, I don't know, they're probably people that have grown up their lives in apartments in Australia, which is a unique thing and a new thing compared to what life used to be like in Australia pre-80s. So I don't know. I guess my question is, what is again the real likelihood of there being a kind of a recalibration on that, because I don't know, foreign debt can be used in to some extent, domestically issued debt, and I understand the point you're making. I mean, the details is all very interesting, but the there does need to be a change, because we simply aren't the same type of nation and productive nation that we once were, and yet how to get from A to B is the question.
Well, okay, a couple of things there, Dan. So we need to be careful we don't get too nostalgic about what we once had, because I do think we still live in just as good a times, even though financially we may be a bit more constrained. I don't think it's all economical. I think social media and the fact that you're on a device 24 hours a day, whereas, I can still remember after 12 o'clock on a Saturday, once the shops closed, there was certainly in a small country town, and Brisbane probably wasn't much different. I always think of the Saints, saying how they couldn't wait to get out of Brisbane in the late 70s because it was such a big dead town. And that's how Brisbane was when, it was described when I first came down in 88, even though we had Expo that year, Brisbane started to transition. But, the beauty of, the not having anything to do was, I think we were able to lower our blood pressure at least once a week on the weekend. And we would kick back and not talk to anyone for 36 hours or 48 hours. So by the time we went back to work again on a Monday, it was actually like, oh, good, let's get back to work. Let's talk to someone, let's interact. And if you go back 50 or 60 years when there was no TV, or when I grew up, we had the commercial channel would come on at 12 o'clock with the Mike Walsh show, and the ABC would come on later that afternoon, and there was no such thing as cartoons in the morning. I can remember cartoons on school holidays being a real thrill. But that sort of sense of emptiness or that void in itself was probably more calming, in the sense that, you had more time to relax and read a book or talk to your mum and dad, or go and, ride your bike 50, 100 times around the block, and find your own adventures. Whereas today it seems to be run, run, run. So it's not all economical, even though I concede a lot of it is, but it's also just the society we live in. I mean, we are, and then of course the social media tends to, you don't talk to people face to face like you do on social media. You're much more reserved face to face. So that's brought its own antagonistic tensions as well. Now the break in all of this, where we're going to head with this, who knows? It would be nice. This is the problem. There's no circuit breaker in the world we live in anymore, where we do set back. And the great example of this is just the constant belligerent rhetoric with the Ukraine-Russian war. Now, it was one thing to play chicken with Iraq, who didn't have nuclear weapons, but it's another thing to do it with Russia. And no one seems to want to try and talk these guys down off the tree, and find a diplomatic resolution. And that's one thing that is another real difference to when I grew up. That I grew up in the shadow of the Cold War. I can just remember that, the '76 Olympics, and then the '80s Olympics, where we all boycotted going to the West, pretty much boycotted going to Moscow, and then '84 in Los Angeles. But Reagan and Gorbachev. There's a great documentary on the '80s, and one was totally devoted to Reagan and how he realised that this whole Cold War thing was getting out of hand. And he had 3 detentos with Gorbachev, and which eventually led to the Berlin Wall coming down in the late '80s, and that unleashed this wonderful decade called the '90s, which I think was the pinnacle of harmonious foreign relations, until unfortunately the September 11th event. And I don't want to sound a little bit tawdry here, but it's probably fair to say that this was how good the '90s was that the biggest political scandal of the '90s was the Bill Clinton Monica Lewinsky affair. And that's how trivial and easy our life was. Whereas today, there's so many big issues going on: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, the entire Middle East hotbed there, China, Taiwan, there's probably other events going on there as well. But and then the whole financial issue, the toxicity in the States with the whole Democrat Republican movement, what we've seen in Great Britain. I mean, these things, there may have been bits of it in the West when I grew up, but it's certainly nowhere near as bad as it is today. But look, what we need a process now whereby I think, we need to be honest. I think immigration has been way too high for way too long. I think we've allowed, I think we still work fairly hard. We just don't work as cleverly as we did, step one. And step two, we let too much of our wealth go offshore. And that's something I know we've touched on before, when you said one of my awakenings was when I suddenly realised, and I remember having this conversation with you at the mall in Billawheeler back in 16 as Senate candidates, whereby I explained to you it's not, you said to me about double taxation. And I said, no, Dan, it's actually the cumulative rate of taxation. That was another circuit breaker where I realised, no, there's another way of looking at this. And that was from my experience at Westfield in accounting for the way they brought money home, where it went through 4 countries, and the sum of it all was still less than 30 cents. Where I suddenly, work up to the cumulative, it's not double taxation, it's the cumulative rate. So we need to look at, this was, as you well know, one of my big policies, and it's another policy that I want to really ram home before the end of this term, is this whole, letting profits, the leakage of profits offshore. Because we want to retain, if we retain more equity, we need less debt. And if we retain more equity and that debt stays here, we then collect more tax revenue. Not that I want higher taxes, but if we can collect more tax revenue, we've got a broader base, we can have a lower tax rate. So, but we will need to obviously come up with a system that's going to pay down the debt, start building infrastructure, and get more, that generates income to pay for hospitals. So we need, and this is one of the things I want to push with people first, is we need a plan. And I'm pushing that as I've got a plan. I'm about to release my tax changes, and as you well know, and the LNP well knows my views on withholding tax and exit taxes offshore. So we need a vision, and we need the leaders of the 2 major parties to get a vision and get some policies that can demonstrate to the people, this is how I'm going to make your life better. This is how I'm going to make sure your children live at least, get the same opportunities as our forefathers gave to us.
Yeah, right. I mean, just to go back, it's not really nostalgia in and of itself, which can be a dead end. It's just the balance between, a cohesive community and the lifestyle, and one which is like both dynamic and virtuous. I think is not what it once was in Australia. And there are all these other challenges, technological and other things, immigration and everything else, which is upsetting the balance. And you just, I don't know, there just needs to be a much clearer plan amongst the political leaders, rather than responding to the latest sort of headline of the day, as to how we kind of walk it back on these things. Because otherwise, in 10 years' time, I mean, you said that no one has a crystal ball, but in 10 years' time, what's your best guess about how the story ends? Do houses double here again, and then it's completely out of the question that any young person can afford it on their own steam? Do we get an even lower percentage of the population? Does our manufacturing base disappear entirely, and we just become a kind of big sheep run or quarry with some overpriced real estate? I mean, how, in addition to the withholding tax and other things, I mean, there has to be some bigger break, recalibration, I think. Otherwise we won't be a country. We'll just be an economic zone which other people own and sort of make use of.
I don't want a big break or a recalibration, because I think the 2 big recalibrations could either be a big economic catastrophic collapse, or an outbreak in a war, and as in, one where we're all getting sucked into it, not some sort of isolated war that's contained within a country. So I'll take the Darwinian approach and try and make things evolve rather than change, because I think anything too disruptive will end up actually making things worse, not better. And we've just got to make changes incrementally, whether it's the tax, monetary policy, productivity, immigration, technology, whatever. That is going to start to put us in a direction where we start to actually feel like we're on the mend, and where our lives are getting better. And I don't think it's going to be a one policy that can do that. I think a certain trigger that could do that is if we got a leader that had the courage to get in and have a go, and actually introduce some hard hitting policies that will change, the way the government collects revenue, the taxation system. And one of the things I'm going to do next week is introduce a motion for a federation convention to look at the duplication of roles between bureaucrats, between state and federal governments, because not only does that cost us billions more in taxpayers' dollars that we don't need, we're getting twice the regulation, often conflicting regulation that is just smashing progress to a halt, and things like that. Any leader that comes out and says we're going to remove the duplication of bureaucracies in this country will win votes on that. Anyone that says we're going to lower immigration will win votes on that. Anyone that says we're going to lower taxes will win votes on that. So, it just takes someone with the courage to stand up to the vested interests to do that. Because I think the people will come with them.
Yeah. Last question, man. I don't like to keep people longer than an hour. Can you ever really, if you don't get in and you're no longer a member of parliament, can you ever really give up politics? I mean, can you ever?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah,
absolutely.
What will you do?
When you say give up, I could definitely go down another rabbit hole. And because I haven't before in my life, like I've always been a political beast, but it's now been almost a decade since I was a weekend warrior. My children are becoming teenagers. They're not far. My eldest son will become a teenager next year. So things like mountain biking, rock climbing, going back, doing, I don't know how far back into the surfing I can get, the whole idea of sort of getting that level of fitness again. But look, I lived overseas for 7 years. I went to 85 countries. And when I was in that, I had nothing to do with politics then. When I came back home for 5 years, I just did nothing but rock climb and mountain bike weekends. And then I said, right, I've got to get back into politics. Well, I've got to get into politics. And then I had 6 years pretty full on in Sydney, in the North Sydney FEC, where Joe Hockey was the sitting member. Had a couple of years out when I had my second son. My mum passed away, then got into it again. And I've been at it basically hammer and tongs since late 2015. So this, by the time I'm out, that would have been 12 years pretty much of political toxicity. So, look, I mean, that's not to say that I won't read it, but, I'm dying to get back on the guitar. I want to finish off my science degree. I want to go back traveling. I haven't been to Ethiopia, Libya, Tunisia. I've never been to South Korea or Japan. There's a heap of countries that, I still want to see. So, you've only got one life, and I guess that's one of the reasons why, to me, politics has always been a plan B. I say plan B, plan A being my family. But it's always been a means to an end for me, and that is for a better life for my children. But if I get to a point where I feel like I can't be effective, and that's why I sort of left the LNP, I just felt that the amount of influence I had within the LNP, I felt I was becoming ineffective. I felt that my presence was being toxic. I felt like it made more of an influence on the outside than on the inside. But look, that's not to say in another 10 years I wouldn't come back, either. And if when my children wanted to get involved, I'd happily try and mentor them in a manner that might help them. But I certainly hope it's not before they're 30, which means I'll be, well on in my 70s by then. But no, I would be more than happy to have time out and just enjoy, the finer things of life. The outdoors, music, good food, things like that.
Yeah, cool, man. I always like that story you tell when it dawned on you one day that you used to be the dude who was watching YouTube videos, and all of a sudden you're on the YouTube video, being the politician rather than, and no doubt there were people sort of yelling at you through the screen or God knows what. But I appreciate your time. Look forward to the future, whichever way, catching up in the future, whichever way it goes, and really appreciate your thoughts. You've always been an interesting dude, man, and long may it last.
Cheers, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks,
okay, cheers, mate.